Hello and welcome back to BookWaves. I'm so glad you're here to continue our story. We return to Elizabeth Gaskell Cranford. In our last episode, we witnessed a shocking tragedy that shook the town's quiet foundations. Now, as we delve into Chapter 3 to Chapter 5, the story takes a more intimate and poignant turn. In the wake of a great loss, a gentle soul is left to navigate the world alone. We come to know the heart of Miss Matty Jenkins, a woman defined by her quiet kindness and deep-seated sense of duty. But what happens when a ghost from her pasta love she was forced to give up decades ago suddenly reappears? Is this a second chance at a happiness she never thought she would know, or is it a final, heartbreaking farewell to a life that might have been? This section of the story is a beautifully tender exploration of memory, regret, and enduring love. As always, I encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments as we listen. And remember, a preview of our next adventure is waiting in the description box below. Thank you for being here. Let's return to the quiet, heartfelt world of Cranford. Chapter 3. I thought that my connection with Cranford would probably cease after the death of Miss Jenkins. At the very least, it would have to be kept up by correspondence. And letters bear much the same relation to personal visits as a book of dried plants does to living flowers in the meadows. I think they call such a thing a hortus siccus. I was pleasantly surprised, therefore, to receive a letter from Miss Pole, who had always stayed for a supplementary week after my annual visit. She proposed that I should go and stay with her. Then, a couple of days after I had accepted, a note came from Miss Matty. In a rather roundabout and very humble manner, she explained how much pleasure I would give her if I could spend a week or two at her house. She added that since her dear sister's death, she was well aware she had no attractions to offer. It was only to the kindness of her friends that she could owe their company. Of course, I promised to go to dear Miss Matty as soon as I had finished my visit with Miss Pole. The day after my arrival in Cranford, I went to see her. I wondered what the house would be like without Miss Jenkins, and I rather dreaded the changed aspect of things. Miss Matty began to cry as soon as she saw me. She was evidently nervous from having anticipated my call. I comforted her as well as I could, and found the best consolation was the honest praise that came from my heart when I spoke of the deceased. Miss Matty slowly shook her head over each virtue as it was named and attributed to her sister. At last, she could not restrain the tears that had been silently flowing. She hid her face behind her handkerchief and sobbed aloud. I took her hand, calling her dear Miss Matty, for I truly did not know how else to tell her how sorry I was for her, left so deserted in the world. She put down her handkerchief and made a request. She explained that she would rather I did not call her Matty. It was a name her sister had not liked. She added, with regret, that she was afraid she had done many things her sister did not approve of, and now she was gone. She asked if I would be so kind to please call her Matilda. I promised faithfully to do so and began to practice the new name with Miss Pole that very day. By degrees, Miss Matilda's feeling on the subject became known throughout Cranford. We all tried to drop the more familiar name, but we had so little success that by and by we gave up the attempt. My visit to Miss Pole was very quiet. Miss Jenkins had for so long taken the lead in Cranford that, now she was gone, they hardly knew how to give a party. The Honorable Mrs. Jameson, to whom even Miss Jenkins had always yielded the post of honor, was fat and inert, and very much at the mercy of her old servants. If they chose that she should give a party, they would remind her of the necessity. If not, she simply let it alone. This gave me all the more time to hear old-world stories from Miss Pole while she sat knitting and I made my father's shirts. I always took a quantity of plain sewing to Cranford. Since we did not read or walk very much, I found it a capital time to get through my work. One of Miss Pole's stories related to a shadow of a love affair, one that had been dimly perceived or suspected many years before. Presently, the time arrived for me to move to Miss Matilda's house. I found her timid and anxious about the arrangements for my comfort. Many a time while I was unpacking, she came backwards and forwards to stir the fire, which only burned all the worse for being so frequently poked. She would ask if I had enough drawers, explaining that she did not know exactly how her sister used to arrange them. She would praise her sister's capital methods and was sure that Deborah could have trained a servant in a week to make a better fire than the one Fanny made, who had now been with her for 4 months. This subject of servants was a standing grievance, and I could not wonder at it. For if gentlemen were scarce in the genteel society of Cranford, their handsome counterparts were abundant in the lower classes. The pretty, neat servant maids had their choice of desirable followers, and their mistresses, even without Miss Matilda's mysterious dread of men and matrimony, might well feel anxious. They worried lest the heads of their comely maids should be turned by the joiner, or the butcher, or the gardener. These men were obliged by their work to come to the house, and, as ill luck would have it, were generally handsome and unmarried. Fanny's lovers, if she had any, were a constant anxiety to her mistress. Miss Matilda suspected her of so many flirtations that if Fanny had not been very pretty, I should have doubted her having even one. She was forbidden by her contract to have followers. And though Fanny had answered with an air of innocence while folding the hem of her apron that she never had more than one at a time, Miss Matty still prohibited that one. But a vision of a man seemed to haunt the kitchen. Fanny assured me it was all my fancy. Otherwise, I would have said myself that I had seen a man's coat-tails whisk into the scullery one night. Another evening, when our watches had stopped, I went to look at the clock. There I saw a very odd appearance, singularly like a young man squeezed between the clock and the open kitchen door. I thought Fanny snatched up the candle very hastily to throw a shadow on the clock face, as she positively told me a time that was half an hour too early. I did not add to Miss Matty's anxieties by naming my suspicions. This was especially true after Fanny mentioned to me the next day that it was such a queer kitchen for odd shadows, and that she was almost afraid to stay. She reminded me that, after all, she saw no other living creature from her 6 o'clock tea until the mistress rang for prayers at 10. However, it so fell out that Fanny had to leave. Miss Matilda begged me to stay and help settle her with the new maid. I consented after hearing from my father that he did not want me at home. The new servant was a rough, honest-looking country girl who had only ever lived on a farm. But I liked her looks when she came to be hired, and I promised Miss Matilda I would put her in the ways of the house. These ways were religiously kept as Miss Matilda thought her sister would approve. Many a domestic rule had been the subject of a plaintive whispered murmur to me during Miss Jenkins's life. But now that she was gone, I do not think that even I, who was a favorite, would have dared to suggest an alteration. To give an instance, we constantly adhered to the forms which had been observed at mealtimes in the house of her father, the rector. Accordingly, we always had wine and dessert. The decanters, however, were only filled when there was a party. What remained was seldom touched, though we each had 2 wine glasses set out every day after dinner. This would continue until the next festive occasion, when the state of the leftover wine was examined in a family council. The dregs were often given to the poor. Occasionally, if a good deal had been left, it might be added to a fresh bottle brought up from the cellar. I fancy poor Captain Brown did not much like wine, for I noticed he never finished his first glass, while most military men take several. Then, as for our dessert, Miss Jenkins used to gather the currants and gooseberries herself. I sometimes thought they would have tasted better fresh from the trees, but Miss Jenkins's reasoning was that, otherwise, there would have been nothing for dessert in the summertime. As it was, we felt very genteel with our 2 glasses apiece, and the elaborate dish of gooseberries, currants, and biscuits before us. When oranges came in, a most curious proceeding was gone through. Miss Jenkins did not like to cut the fruit, explaining that the juice all ran out to unknown places. She believed that sucking, though I think she used a more obscure word, for it was the only true way of enjoying oranges. But this was unpleasantly associated with a ceremony often performed by little babies, and so, after dessert during orange season, Miss Jenkins and Miss Matty would rise from the table. They would each take an orange in silence and withdraw to the privacy of their own rooms, there to indulge in the act of eating them. I had once or twice tried on such occasions to prevail on Miss Matty to stay and eat her orange with me. I had even succeeded once in her sister's lifetime, after I held up a screen and promised not to look. Miss Matty had said then that she tried not to make the noise too offensive, but now that she was left alone, she seemed quite horrified when I begged her to remain. She could not enjoy her orange in the warm dining parlor as she liked best, and so it was with everything. Miss Jenkins' rules were made more stringent than ever, because the framer of them was gone where there could be no appeal. In all things else, Miss Matilda was meek and undecided to a fault. I have heard the former maid, Fanny, turn her round 20 times in a morning about dinner, just as the little hussy chose. I sometimes fancied she worked on Miss Matilda's weakness in order to bewilder her and to make her feel more in the power of her clever servant. I determined that I would not leave her until I had seen what sort of a person the new maid, Martha, was. If I found her trustworthy, I would tell her not to trouble her mistress with every little decision. Martha was blunt and plain spoken to a fault. Otherwise, she was a brisk, well-meaning, but very ignorant girl. She had not been with us a week before Miss Matilda and I were astounded one morning by a letter from a cousin. He had been in India for 20 or 30 years, and had lately, as we had seen in the army list, returned to England with an invalid wife. Major Jenkins wrote to propose that he and his wife should spend a night at Cranford on their way to Scotland. He suggested staying at the inn if it did not suit Miss Matilda to receive them, in which case they should hope to be with her as much as possible during the day. Of course, it had to suit her, as she said, for all of Cranford knew she had her sister's bedroom at liberty. But I am sure she wished the Major had stopped in India and forgotten his cousins completely. She asked helplessly how she could possibly manage. She lamented that if only Deborah had been alive, she would have known exactly what to do with a gentleman visitor. She fretted over whether she must put razors in his dressing room and cried out in despair that she had none, whereas Deborah would surely have had them. She worried aloud about slippers and coat brushes. I suggested he would likely bring these things himself. She then fretted about dinner, asking how she was to know when to rise and leave him to his wine. Deborah, she sighed, would have done it all so well and would have been quite in her element. She wondered if he would want coffee. I undertook the management of the coffee and told her I would instruct Martha in the art of waiting, in which the girl was terribly deficient. I added that I had no doubt the Major and his wife would understand the quiet way in which a lady lived by herself in a country town, but she was sadly fluttered. I made her empty her decanters and bring up 2 fresh bottles of wine. I wished I could have prevented her from being present at my instructions to Martha, for she frequently cut in with some fresh direction, muddling the poor girl's mind as she stood open-mouthed, listening to us both. I told Martha to hand the vegetables round, a foolishly ambitious goal, I now see. Seeing her look bewildered, I clarified that she should take the vegetables to people and let them help themselves. Miss Matilda then put in that she must mind to go to the ladies first, always before the gentlemen. Martha promised to do as she was told, but added that she, personally, liked the lads best. We felt very uncomfortable and shocked at this speech, yet I do not think she meant any harm. On the whole, she attended very well to our directions, except that she nudged the Major when he did not help himself to the potatoes as soon as she expected. When they did come, the Major and his wife were quiet and unpretending people. They seemed languid, as I suppose all East Indians are. We were rather dismayed at their bringing 2 servants with them, a Hindu body servant for the Major and a steady, elderly maid for his wife. But they slept at the inn, which took a good deal of the responsibility off of us, as they attended carefully to their masters' and mistress's comfort. Martha, to be sure, never ended hers staring at the East Indian's white turban and brown complexion. I saw that Miss Matilda herself shrunk away from him a little as he waited at dinner. Indeed, after they were gone, she asked me if he did not remind me of the tale of Blue Beard. On the whole, the visit was most satisfactory, and it remains a subject of conversation with Miss Matilda, even now. At the time, it greatly excited Cranford. It even stirred the apathetic and honorable Mrs. Jameson to some expression of interest. This was when I went to call on her, to thank her for the kind answers she had given to Miss Matilda's inquiries about arranging a gentleman's dressing room. I must confess, she had given these answers in the wearied manner of a Scandinavian prophetess who wished only to be left to her repose. And now, I come to the love affair. It seems that Miss Pole had a cousin, once or twice removed, who had made an offer to Miss Matty long ago. This cousin lived 4 or 5 miles from Cranford on his own estate. But his property was not large enough to entitle him to rank higher than a yeoman. Or rather, with a kind of pride that apes humility, he had refused to push himself on into the ranks of the squires as so many of his class had done. He would not allow himself to be called Thomas Holbrook, Esquire. He even sent back letters with this address, informing the postmistress that his name was Mr. Thomas Holbrook, yeoman. He rejected all domestic innovations. He preferred the house door to stand open in summer and be shut in winter, without a knocker or a bell to summon a servant. A closed fist or the knob of a stick did the office for him if he found the door locked. He despised every refinement that did not have its root deep in humanity. If people were not ill, he saw no necessity for moderating his voice. He spoke the dialect of the country to perfection and constantly used it in conversation. Although, as Miss Pole informed me, he also read aloud more beautifully and with more feeling than anyone she had ever heard, except for the late rector. I asked Miss Pole how it came to be that Miss Matilda had not married him. She confessed she did not know for sure, but she thought Miss Matty herself had been willing enough. The problem, she suspected, was that her cousin Thomas would not have been considered enough of a gentleman for the rector and for Miss Jenkins. I remarked impatiently that they were not the ones who were to marry him. Miss Pole agreed, but explained that they did not like Miss Matty to marry below her rank. She reminded me that her friend was the rector's daughter and was somehow related to Sir Peter Arley, a fact Miss Jenkins thought a great deal of. I could only express my sympathy for poor Miss Matty. Miss Pole then softened her stance, saying she knew nothing more than that he had offered and was refused. Perhaps Miss Matty did not like him, or perhaps Miss Jenkins had never said a word. It was only her own guess. I inquired if she had ever seen him since. Miss Pole thought not. She explained that his house, Woodley, lay halfway between Cranford and Misselton. He had made Misselton his market town very soon after his offer had been refused. She did not think he had been into Cranford more than once or twice since. She recalled one time when walking with Miss Matty, her friend had suddenly darted away up Shire Lane. A few minutes later, Miss Pole herself was startled by meeting Cousin Thomas. After a pause of my own castle building, I asked how old he was. With a sigh, Miss Pole replied that he must be about 70, a statement which blew up my castle as if by gunpowder. Very soon after, during my long visit, I had the opportunity of seeing Mr. Holbrook myself. I also saw his first encounter with his former love after a separation of 30 or 40 years. I was in the shop, helping Miss Matty decide on a silk to match a gown, when a tall, thin, Don Quixote-looking old man came in for some woolen gloves. I had never seen the striking-looking person before, and I watched him attentively while Miss Matty listened to the shopman. The stranger wore a blue coat with brass buttons, drab breeches, and gaiters. He drummed his fingers on the counter until he was attended to. When he answered the shop boy's polite inquiry, I saw Miss Matilda start and then suddenly sit down. Instantly, I guessed who it was. She had made some request which had to be carried to the other shopman. That other man called out that Miss Jenkins wanted the black sarcenet. Mr. Holbrook had caught the name and was across the shop in 2 strides. He called out her name, Matty, then Miss Matilda, then Miss Jenkins, exclaiming his surprise and blessing his soul. He could not have known her, he said. He kept shaking her hand with a warmth that proved his friendship, but he repeated to himself so often that he would not have known her that it did away with any sentimental romance I might have been building in my mind. However, he kept talking to us all the time we were in the shop. Then he waved the shopman with the unpurchased gloves aside, telling him it would have to be another time, and walked home with us. I am happy to report that Miss Matilda also left the shop in an equally bewildered state, having purchased neither green nor red silk. Mr. Holbrook was evidently full of honest, loud-spoken joy at meeting his old love again. He touched on the changes that had taken place. He even referred to the late Miss Jenkins with a forgiving air, remarking that we all have our faults. He bade us goodbye with many hopes that he would see Miss Matty again. She went straight to her room and never came back until our early tea time. When she did, I thought she looked as if she had been crying. Chapter 4. A few days later, a note came from Mr. Holbrook. It was written in a formal, old-fashioned style, impartially asking both of us to spend a day at his house. A long June day, for it was now June. He mentioned that he had also invited his cousin, Miss Pole, so that we might join in a fly which could be put up at his house. I expected Miss Matty to jump at this invitation, but she did not. Miss Pole and I had the greatest difficulty in persuading her to go. First, she thought it was improper. She was even half annoyed when we utterly ignored the idea of any impropriety in her going with 2 other ladies to see her old lover. Then came a more serious difficulty. She did not think her sister, Deborah, would have liked her to go. This took us half a day of good, hard talking to overcome. But at the first hint of her relenting, I seized the opportunity. I wrote and dispatched an acceptance in her name, fixing the day and hour so that all might be decided. The next morning she asked me to go down to the shop with her. There, after much hesitation, we chose 3 caps to be sent home and tried on, so that the most becoming might be selected to take with us on Thursday. She was in a state of silent agitation all the way to Woodley. She had evidently never been there before, and although she little dreamed that I knew anything of her early story, I could see she was in a tremor. She trembled at the thought of seeing the place which might have been her home, and around which it is probable that many of her innocent, girlish imaginations had once clustered. It was a long drive through paved, jolting lanes. Miss Matilda sat bolt upright and looked wistfully out of the windows as we drew near our journey's end. The country around us was quiet and pastoral. Woodley stood among fields, with an old-fashioned garden where roses and currant bushes touched one another. The feathery asparagus formed a pretty background to the pinks and gillyflowers. There was no drive up to the door. We got out at a little gate and walked up a straight box-edged path. Miss Pole, who was afraid of an earache and wore only her cap, remarked that she thought her cousin might make a drive. But Miss Matty replied in a soft, plaintive whisper that she thought it was very pretty. Her words were hushed, for just then Mr. Holbrook appeared at the door, rubbing his hands in an effervescence of hospitality. He looked more like my idea of Don Quixote than ever, yet the likeness was only external. His respectable housekeeper stood modestly at the door to bid us welcome. And while she led the elder ladies upstairs to a bedroom, I begged to look about the garden. My request evidently pleased the old gentleman. He took me all around the place and showed me his 26 cows, which were named after the different letters of the alphabet. As we went along, he occasionally surprised me by repeating apt and beautiful quotations from the poets, ranging easily from Shakespeare and George Herbert to those of our own day. He did this as naturally as if he were thinking aloud, their beautiful words being the best expression he could find for his thoughts and feelings. To be sure, he called Byron my Lord Byron, and pronounced the name of Goethe strictly in the English fashion, as he quoted a line about ye ever-verdant palaces. Altogether, I have never met a man, before or since, who had spent so long a life in a secluded and unimpressive country, with such an ever-increasing delight in the daily and yearly changes of season and beauty. When he and I went in, we found that dinner was nearly ready in what I suppose must be called the kitchen. There were oak dressers and cupboards all around the fireplace, with only a small turkey carpet in the middle of the flag floor. The room could have been easily made into a handsome dining parlor by removing the oven and a few other kitchen items that were evidently never used. The actual cooking took place at some distance. The room in which we were expected to sit was stiffly furnished and ugly, but the room in which we did sit was what Mr. Holbrook called the counting house. It was where he paid his laborers their weekly wages at a great desk near the door. The rest of this pretty sitting room, which looked into the orchard and was filled with dancing tree shadows, was covered in books. They lay on the ground, they covered the walls, they were strewn across the table. He was evidently half ashamed and half proud of his extravagance in this respect. They were of all kinds, with poetry and wild, weird tales being the most prevalent. He evidently chose his books according to his own tastes, not because they were considered classics or established favorites. He remarked with a sigh that farmers ought not to have much time for reading, yet somehow one could not help it. Miss Matty whispered what a pretty room it was, and I, almost at the same moment, said aloud what a pleasant place it was. He replied, pleased that we liked it, but questioned if we could sit on the great black leather, three-cornered chairs. He admitted he liked it better than the best parlor, but he had thought ladies would find that room to be the smarter place. It was the smarter place, but like most smart things, it was not at all pretty, or pleasant, or homelike. So, while we were at dinner, the servant girl dusted and scrubbed the counting-house chairs, and we sat there for the rest of the day. We had pudding before meat. I thought Mr. Holbrook was about to apologize for his old-fashioned ways, as he began by asking if we liked new-fangled customs. Miss Matty assured him we did not. He agreed heartily. He said his housekeeper insisted on her new fashion, otherwise he would tell her that when he was a young man, they kept strictly to his father's rule. That rule, he explained, was no broth, no ball, no beef. They always began dinner with broth. Then they had suet puddings boiled in the broth with the beef, and then the meat itself. If a person did not sup their broth, they had no ball, which they liked much better. And the beef came last of all, and only those who had done justice to the broth and the ball received it. He lamented that folks nowadays begin with sweet things and turn their dinners completely topsy-turvy. When the ducks and green peas came, we looked at each other in dismay. We had only two-pronged, black-handled forks, It is true the steel was as bright as silver, but what were we to do? Miss Matty picked up her peas one by one on the point of the prongs, much as the character Amine ate her grains of rice. Miss Pole sighed over her delicate young peas as she left them on one side of her plate, for they would simply drop between the prongs. I looked at my host. The peas were going wholesale into his capacious mouth, shoveled up by his large round-ended knife. I saw, I imitated, and I survived. My friends, in spite of my precedent, could not muster enough courage to do such an ungenteel thing. And if Mr. Holbrook had not been so heartily hungry, he would probably have seen that the good peas went away almost untouched. After dinner, a clay pipe and a spittoon were brought in. Mr. Holbrook asked us to retire to another room if we disliked tobacco smoke, saying he would soon join us. But first, in a gesture that was a compliment to a lady in his youth, he presented his pipe to Miss Matty and requested that she fill the bowl. This was rather inappropriate to propose as an honor to Miss Matty, who had been trained by her sister to hold smoking of every kind in utter abhorrence. But if it was a shock to her refinement, it was also a gratification to her feelings to be thus selected. So she daintily stuffed the strong tobacco into the pipe, and then we withdrew. As we settled ourselves in the counting-house, Miss Matty said softly how very pleasant it was, dining with a bachelor. She only hoped it was not improper, as so many pleasant things often were. Miss Pole looked around the room, remarking on the number of books and how dusty they were. Miss Matty thought it must be like one of the great Dr. Johnson's rooms, and declared that Miss Pole's cousin must be a superior man. Miss Pole agreed that he was a great reader, but she was afraid he had gotten into very uncouth habits from living alone. Miss Matty quickly defended him. She replied that uncouth was too hard a word. She would call him eccentric, as very clever people always are. When Mr. Holbrook returned, he proposed a walk in the fields. But the two elder ladies were afraid of damp and dirt, and had only very unbecoming calashes to put on over their caps, so they declined. I was again his companion in a turn he said he was obliged to take to see after his men. He strode along, either wholly forgetting my existence, or soothed into silence by his pipe, and yet it was not silence exactly. He walked before me with a stooping gait, his hands clasped behind him. As some tree or cloud or glimpse of distant pasture struck him, he quoted poetry to himself. He said it out loud in a grand, sonorous voice, with the just emphasis that true feeling gives. We came upon an old cedar tree, and he quoted a line about the cedar spreading its dark green layers of shade. He then exclaimed to himself what a capital term layers was, and what a wonderful man the poet must be. I did not know if he was speaking to me, but I put in an assenting wonderful, just because I was tired of being forgotten. He turned sharp round, exclaiming that I may well say wonderful. He told me that when he saw the review of the poems in Blackwood, he had set off within an hour and walked 7 miles to Misselton to order them. He then suddenly and vehemently asked me what color ashbuds are in March. The question made me wonder if the man was going mad. He seemed so very like Don Quixote. He repeated the question with force. With the meekness of ignorance, I confessed that I was sure I did not know. He said he knew I didn't. No more did he. An old fool that he was. until this young poet had come and told him. The answer, he revealed, was that they were as black as ash buds in March, and he had lived all his life in the country. It was a shame he did not know. He declared that they were jet black, and then he went off again, swinging along to the music of some new rhyme he had gotten hold of. When we came back, nothing would serve him but that he must read us the poems he had been speaking of. Miss Pole encouraged him in this. I thought it was because she wished me to hear his beautiful reading, of which she had boasted. But she later said it was because she had reached a difficult part of her crochet and wanted to count her stitches without talking. Whatever he had proposed would have been right to Miss Matty. Although she did fall sound asleep within 5 minutes after he had begun a long poem called Locksley Hall, she had a comfortable nap, unobserved, until he ended. The cessation of his voice wakened her. Feeling that something was expected, she remarked what a pretty book it was. Mr. Holbrook exclaimed that it was not pretty, it was beautiful. Flustered at his disapproval, she quickly agreed, saying she had meant beautiful. She then tried to compare it to a beautiful poem by Dr. Johnson that her sister used to read. But she could not recall its name or what it was about. She turned to me for help, but I did not know either. Mr. Holbrook reflected that he did not know Dr. Johnson's poems well, and that he must read them. As we were getting into the fly to return, I heard Mr. Holbrook announce that he would call on the ladies soon to inquire how they got home. This evidently pleased and fluttered Miss Matty at the time. But once we had lost sight of the old house among the trees, her thoughts were absorbed by a distressing wonder as to whether Martha had broken her word and seized on the opportunity of her mistress's absence to have a follower. Martha looked good and steady and composed enough as she came to help us out. She was always careful of Miss Matty, and tonight she made use of a most unlucky speech. She remarked with concern that it was surprising to see Miss Matty out in such a thin shawl, telling her that at her age she should be careful. Miss Matty, almost crossly for her, repeated the phrase, "my age," and asked Martha just how old she thought she was. Martha guessed she was not far short of 60, but added that looks were often against people, and that she meant no harm. With grave emphasis, Miss Matty stated that she was not yet 52. I suspect the remembrance of her youth had come very vividly before her this day, and she was annoyed at finding that golden time so far away in the past. But she never spoke of any former and more intimate acquaintance with Mr. Holbrook. She had probably met with so little sympathy in her early love that she had shut it up close in her heart. It was only by a sort of watching, which I could hardly avoid since Miss Pole's confidence, that I saw how faithful her poor heart had been in its sorrow and its silence. She gave me some good reason for wearing her best cap every day and sat near the window, in spite of her rheumatism, in order to see, without being seen, down into the street. He came. He put his open palms upon his knees, which were far apart, as he sat with his head bent down, whistling, after we had replied to his inquiries about our safe return. Suddenly he jumped up. He asked if we had any commands for Paris, announcing that he was going there in a week or two. We both exclaimed in surprise. He explained that he had never been there, but had always wished to go, and he felt that if he did not go soon, he might not go at all. so as soon as the hay was gathered, he would go before harvest time. We were so much astonished that we had no commissions to give him. Just as he was going out of the room, he turned back with his favorite exclamation, blessing his soul and saying he had nearly forgotten half his errand. He tugged a parcel from his coat pocket. It was the book of poems we had admired so much at his house. He wished me goodbye, and then wished Matty goodbye, telling her to take care of herself, and then he was gone. But he had given her a book, and he had called her Matty, just as he used to do 30 years ago. Miss Matilda anxiously wished he would not go to Paris. She said she did not believe frogs would agree with him. She recalled that he used to have to be very careful about what he ate, which had always seemed curious in so strong-looking a young man. Soon after this, I took my leave. I gave many instructions to Martha to look after her mistress and to let me know if she thought Miss Matilda was not so well. In which case, I would volunteer a visit to my old friend without revealing Martha's summons to her. Accordingly, I received a line or two from Martha every now and then. And, about November, I had a note with an account that made me so uneasy that I packed my things and went, although Martha had not decidedly summoned me. Her note described her mistress as being very low and sadly off her food. I received a warm welcome in spite of the little flurry produced by my impromptu visit. I had only been able to give a day's notice. Miss Matilda looked miserably ill, and I prepared to comfort and cosset her. I went down to have a private talk with Martha. As I stood by the kitchen fire, I asked how long her mistress had been so poorly. Martha thought it had been for more than a fortnight. She knew it had started on a Tuesday after Miss Pole had visited. At first, she thought her mistress was just tired and that it would go off with a night's rest. But it had gone on and on ever since until she felt it her duty to write to me. I told her she had done quite right and that it was a comfort to think Miss Matty had such a faithful servant. I then asked if she found her place comfortable. Martha replied that the missus was very kind, with plenty to eat and drink and easy work, but then she hesitated. When I prompted her, she explained what was on her mind. It seemed so hard of her mistress not to let her have any followers. There were, she lamented, such a lot of young fellows in the town, and many had offered to keep company with her. She felt she might never be in such a likely place again, and it was like wasting an opportunity. Many a girl she knew would have them over without the mistress ever knowing. But she had given her word, and she would stick to it. Otherwise, the house was perfect for secrecy. The kitchen was so capable, with such dark corners, she was bound she could hide anyone. She confessed that only last Sunday night she had been crying because she had to shut the door in Jem Hearn's face. He was a steady young man, fit for any girl, but she had given her word. Martha was all but crying again. I had little comfort to give her, for I knew from old experience of the horror with which both the Miss Jenkinses looked upon followers. In Miss Matty's present nervous state, this dread was not likely to be lessened. I went to see Miss Pole the next day and took her completely by surprise, for she had not been to see Miss Matilda for 2 days. She immediately announced that she must go back with me. She explained that she had promised to let her know how Thomas Holbrook was getting on. Then she added with great sorrow that his housekeeper had sent word that day that he had not long to live. Poor Thomas, she sighed. That journey to Paris had been quite too much for him. His housekeeper had said he had hardly been round his field since his return. He just sat with his hands on his knees in the counting-house, not reading or doing anything, only remarking on what a wonderful city Paris was. Miss Pole felt that Paris had much to answer for if it had killed her cousin Thomas, for a better man never lived. A new light dawning on me as to the cause of Miss Matty's indisposition, I asked if she knew of his illness. Miss Pole confirmed it at once. Of course she knew. She seemed surprised that her friend had not told me. She herself had let her know a fortnight ago or more, when first she heard of it. I thought it best not to say anything. I felt almost guilty for having spied too curiously into that tender heart, and I was not going to speak of its secrets, which Miss Matty believed were hidden from all the world. I ushered Miss Pole into Miss Matilda's little drawing-room and then left them alone. But I was not surprised when Martha came to my bedroom door and asked me to go down to dinner alone, explaining that her missus had one of her bad headaches. She came into the drawing-room at tea-time, but it was evidently an effort for her. As if to make up for some reproachful feeling against her late sister, which had been troubling her, she now felt penitent. She kept telling me how good and how clever Deborah was in her youth, how she used to settle what gowns they were to wear, and had started the benefit society for the poor. She told of how Deborah had once danced with a lord and visited at Sir Peter Arley's and had tried to remodel the rectory on the grand plans of Arley Hall. And she told of how Deborah had nursed her through a long, long illness, one I had never heard of before, but which I now dated in my own mind as following the dismissal of Mr. Holbrook's suit. So we talked softly and quietly of old times through the long November evening. The next day, Miss Pole brought us the news that Mr. Holbrook was dead. Miss Matty heard it in silence. In fact, from the account of the previous day, it was only what we had to expect. Miss Pole kept calling upon us for some expression of regret, asking if it was not sad that he was gone. She lamented to think of that pleasant day last June when he had seemed so well. She felt he might have lived for a dozen more years if he had not gone to that wicked Paris with its constant revolutions. She paused for some demonstration on our part. I saw Miss Matty could not speak. She was trembling so nervously, so I said what I really felt. And after a call of some duration, during which I have no doubt Miss Pole thought Miss Matty received the news very calmly, our visitor took her leave. Miss Matty made a strong effort to conceal her feelings, a concealment she practiced even with me. She has never alluded to Mr. Holbrook again, though the book he gave her lies with her Bible on the little table by her bedside. I do not think she knew that I overheard her ask the little milliner to make her caps something like the Honorable Mrs. Jamieson's. Nor do I think she knew I noticed the milliner's reply, questioning if she was aware that Mrs. Jamieson wore widow's caps. Miss Matty, flustered, had clarified that she only meant something in that style, not a widow's cap, of course, but rather like it. This effort at concealment was the beginning of the tremulous motion of head and hands which I have seen in Miss Matty ever since. The evening of the day we heard of Mr. Holbrook's death, Miss Matilda was very silent and thoughtful. After prayers, she called Martha back and then stood, uncertain what to say. At last, she told Martha that she was young. After a long pause, which Martha prompted her to end with a curtsy, she continued. She said that perhaps Martha might someday meet a young man she liked and who liked her in return. She acknowledged that she had told her not to have followers, but if she met with such a respectable young man and told her about him, she would have no objection to him visiting once a week. In a low voice, she added a prayer that she should not be the cause of grieving any young hearts. She spoke as if providing for a distant possibility and was rather startled by Martha's ready and eager answer. Martha immediately brought up Jem Hearn. She described him as a joiner who made 3 and 6 pence a day and stood 6'1" in his stocking feet. She assured her mistress that if she asked about him in the morning, everyone would give him a character for steadiness. She was bound, she said, that he would be glad enough to come the very next night. Though Miss Matty was startled, she submitted to fate and love. Chapter 5. I have often noticed that almost everyone has his own individual small economies. These are careful habits of saving fractions of pennies in some one peculiar direction. Any disturbance of these habits often annoys a person more than spending shillings or pounds on a real extravagance. An old gentleman of my acquaintance provides a perfect example. He took the news of a joint stock bank failure with stoical mildness, even though some of his money was invested in it. Yet, he worried his family all through a long summer's day because one of them had torn, instead of cutting, the written leaves from his now useless bank book. This little unnecessary waste of paper, his private economy, chafed him more than all the loss of his money. Envelopes fretted his soul terribly when they first came in. The only way he could reconcile himself to such waste was by patiently turning inside out all that were sent to him, and so making them serve again. Even now, though tamed by age, I see him casting wistful glances at his daughters when they use a whole half sheet of notepaper for just 3 lines of acceptance to an invitation. I am not above owning that I have this human weakness myself. String is my foible. My pockets get full of little hanks of it, picked up and twisted together, ready for uses that never come. I am seriously annoyed if anyone cuts the string of a parcel instead of patiently undoing it fold by fold. How people can bring themselves to use India rubber rings, a sort of deification of string, as lightly as they do, I cannot imagine. To me, an India rubber ring is a precious treasure. I have one that I picked up off the floor nearly 6 years ago. I have really tried to use it, but my heart failed me, and I could not commit the extravagance. Small pieces of butter grieve others. They cannot attend to conversation because of the annoyance caused by the habit some people have of taking more butter than they want. I am sure you have seen the anxious, almost mesmeric look which such persons fix on the article. They would feel it a relief if they might bury it out of their sight by popping it into their own mouths and swallowing it down. They are made truly happy if the person on whose plate it lies unused suddenly breaks off a piece of toast he does not want at all and eats up his butter. They think that this is not waste. Now Miss Matty Jenkins was chary of candles. We had many devices to use as few as possible. In the winter afternoons, she would sit knitting for 2 or 3 hours, a task she could do in the dark or by firelight. When I asked if I might ring for candles to finish my stitching, she would tell me it was time to keep a blind man's holiday. The candles were usually brought in with tea, but we only burnt one at a time. As we lived in constant preparation for a friend who might come in any evening, though one never did, it required some contrivance to keep our 2 candles the same length. They had to look as if we burnt 2 always. The candles took it in turns. Whatever we might be talking about, Miss Matty's eyes were habitually fixed upon the burning candle. She was always ready to jump up and extinguish it, and to light the other, before they had become too uneven in length to be restored to equality in the course of the evening. One night, I remember this candle economy particularly annoyed me. I had grown very tired of my compulsory holiday from sewing in the dim light, especially as Miss Matty had fallen asleep. I did not like to stir the fire and run the risk of awakening her, so I could not even sit on the rug and scorch myself with my work by firelight, as was my custom. I fancied Miss Matty must be dreaming of her early life, for she spoke 1 or 2 words in her uneasy sleep that referred to persons long since dead. When Martha brought in the lighted candle and tea, Miss Matty started into wakefulness with a strange, bewildered look, as if we were not the people she expected to see. A little sad expression shadowed her face as she recognized me, but she immediately tried to give me her usual smile. All through tea time, her talk ran upon the days of her childhood and youth. Perhaps this reminded her of the need to look over all the old family letters and destroy those that ought not to fall into the hands of strangers. She had often spoken of this task, but had always shrunk from it with a timid dread of something painful. Tonight, however, she rose up after tea and went to fetch them. She went in the dark, for she prided herself on the precise neatness of her chamber arrangements, and used to look at me uneasily whenever I lighted a bed candle for any reason. When she returned, a faint, pleasant smell of Tonquin beans filled the room. I had always noticed this scent about any of the things which had belonged to her mother, and many of the letters were indeed addressed to her yellow bundles of love letters, 60 or 70 years old. Miss Matty undid the packet with a sigh, but she stifled it directly, as if it were hardly right to regret the flight of time, or of life itself. We agreed to look them over separately. Each of us would take a different letter from the same bundle and describe its contents to the other before destroying it. I never knew what sad work the reading of old letters was before that evening, though I could hardly tell why. The letters were as happy as letters could be, at least those early ones were. There was in them a vivid and intense sense of the present time, which seemed so strong and full, as if it could never pass away. It felt as if the warm, living hearts that so expressed themselves could never die and become as nothing to the sunny earth. I believe I should have felt less melancholy if the letters had been more so. I saw the tears stealing down the well-worn furrows of Miss Matty's cheeks, and her spectacles often wanted wiping. I hoped at last that she would light the other candle, for my own eyes were rather dim, and I wanted more light to see the pale, faded ink. But no. Even through her tears, she saw and remembered her little economical ways. The earliest set of letters consisted of 2 bundles tied together. The ticket, in Miss Jenkins's handwriting, stated that they were letters interchanged between her ever-honored father and dearly beloved mother prior to their marriage in July of 1774. I would guess the rector of Cranford was about 27 when he wrote those letters, and Miss Matty told me her mother was just 18 at the time of her wedding. With my idea of the rector, derived from his stiff and stately portrait in the dining parlor, it was strange to read his letters. They were full of eager, passionate ardor and short, homely sentences fresh from the heart. This was very different from the grand, Latinized, Johnsonian style of his printed sermon. His letters were a curious contrast to those of his girl bride. She was evidently rather annoyed at his demands for expressions of love and could not quite understand his meaning when he repeated the same thing in so many different ways. What she was quite clear about, however, was a longing for a white Padua soy, whatever that might be. 6 or 7 letters were principally occupied with asking her lover to use his influence with her parents to obtain this or that article of dress, especially the white paduasoy. He cared nothing for how she was dressed. He took pains to assure her that she was always lovely enough for him, especially when she begged him to express a preference for certain fineries in his replies so she could show them to her parents. But at length, he seemed to realize that she would not be married until she had a trousseau to her mind. He then sent her a letter, accompanying a whole box of finery, in which he requested that she might be dressed in everything her heart desired. This was the first letter ticketed in a frail, delicate hand with the words identifying it as being from her dearest John. I suppose they were married shortly afterwards, judging from the interruption in their correspondence. Looking at me doubtfully, Miss Matty said she thought they must burn them. She reasoned that no one would care for them when she was gone, and one by one she dropped them into the middle of the fire. She watched each blaze up, die out, and rise away in a faint, white, ghostly semblance up the chimney before giving another to the same fate. The room was light enough now, but I, like her, was fascinated, watching the destruction of those letters into which the honest warmth of a manly heart had been poured forth. The next letter, also docketed by Miss Jenkins, was endorsed with a long title. It was described as a letter of pious congratulation and exhortation from her venerable grandfather to her beloved mother on the occasion of Miss Jenkins's own birth. It also promised some practical remarks on the desirability of keeping warm the extremities of infants from her excellent grandmother. The first part of the letter was, indeed, a severe and forcible picture of the responsibilities of mothers. It was a warning against the evils of the world, lying in ghastly wait for the little baby of 2 days old. The old gentleman noted that his wife did not write because he had forbidden it, as a sprained ankle had, in his words, quite incapacitated her from holding a pen. However, at the foot of the page was a small note instructing the reader to turn the page over, and on the back, sure enough, there was a letter addressed to his dearest Molly. In it, the grandmother begged her, when she left her room, to always go upstairs before going down. She also told her to wrap the baby's feet in flannel and keep it warm by the fire, even though it was summer, because babies were so tender. It was pretty to see from the letters, which were evidently exchanged with some frequency between the young mother and the grandmother, how the girlish vanity was being weeded out of her heart by love for her baby. The white paduasoy figured again in the letters, with almost as much vigor as before. In one, it was being made into a christening cloak for the baby. It decked the infant when it went with its parents to spend a day or two at Arley Hall. It added to its charms, as the mother wrote that it was the prettiest little baby that ever was seen. She wished her own mother could see her. She added that, without any partiality, she truly thought the child would grow up to be a regular beauty. I thought of Miss Jenkins, gray, withered, and wrinkled, and I wondered if her mother had known her in the courts of heaven. And then I knew that she had, and that they stood there together in angelic guise. There was a great gap in time before any of the rector's letters appeared. By then, his wife's mode of endorsement had changed. It was no longer from her dearest John. It was from her honored husband. The letters were written on the occasion of the publication of the same sermon that was represented in the picture. The preaching before a judge and the publishing by request was evidently the culminating point, the great event of his life. It had been necessary for him to go to London to superintend it through the press. Many friends had to be called upon and consulted before he could decide on any printer fit for so onerous a task. At length, it was arranged that the publishing house of John and James Rivington was to have the honorable responsibility. The worthy rector seemed to be strung up to a high literary pitch by the occasion, for he could hardly write a letter to his wife without using Latin phrases. I remember the end of one of his letters ran with a Latin vow to always hold the virtuous qualities of his Molly in remembrance. This was quite a thing to write to a wife whose English was often at fault in grammar and spelling, and might be taken as proof of how much he idealized his Molly. As Miss Jenkins used to say, "People talk a great deal about idealizing nowadays, whatever that may mean. But this was nothing to a fit of writing classical poetry which soon seized him, in which his Molly figured as Maria." The letter containing this poem was endorsed by her with a note about receiving Hebrew verses from her honored husband. She had thought to have a letter about killing the pig, she wrote, but supposed she must wait. She had also made a memorandum to send the poetry to Sir Peter Arley, as her husband desired. A postscript in his own hand stated that the ode had appeared in the Gentleman's Magazine in December of 1782. Her letters back to her husband, which he treasured as fondly as if they had been Cicero's epistles, were more satisfactory to an absent husband and father than his could ever have been to her. She told him how Deborah sewed her seam very neatly every day and read to her in the books he had set for her. She described how she was a very forward, good child, but would ask questions her mother could not answer. In those moments, she wrote, she did not let herself down by admitting her ignorance, but instead took to stirring the fire or sending the forward child on an errand. Matty was now the mother's darling, and promised, like her sister at her age, to be a great beauty. I was reading this aloud to Miss Matty, who smiled and sighed a little at the fondly expressed hope that little Matty might not be vain, even if she were, as the letter spelled it, a beauty. She looked at me and remarked that she did have very pretty hair and not a bad mouth, and I saw her soon afterwards adjust her cap and draw herself up. But to return to Mrs. Jenkins' letters, she told her husband about the poor in the parish, what homely domestic medicines she had administered, and what kitchen physic she had sent. She had evidently held his displeasure as a rod in pickle over the heads of all the ne'er-do-wells. She asked for his directions about the cows and pigs, and did not always obtain them, as I have shown before. The kind old grandmother was dead when a little boy was born, soon after the publication of the sermon. But there was another letter of exhortation from the grandfather, more stringent and admonitory than ever, now that there was a boy to be guarded from the snares of the world. He described all the various sins into which men might fall, until I wondered how any man ever came to a natural death. The gallows seemed as if it must have been the termination of the lives of most of the grandfather's friends and acquaintances. I was not surprised at the way he spoke of this life as being a vale of tears. It seemed curious that I should never have heard of this brother before, but I concluded that he had died young. Otherwise, surely his name would have been alluded to by his sisters. By and by, we came to packets of Miss Jenkins' letters. These, Miss Matty did regret to burn. She explained that all the others had been only interesting to those who loved the writers. It would have hurt her, she felt, to allow them to fall into the hands of strangers who had not known her dear mother and how good she was, even if she did not always spell in the modern fashion. But Deborah's letters were so very superior. Anyone, she insisted, might profit by reading them. It was a long time since she had read Mrs. Chapone, but she used to think that Deborah could have said the same things quite as well. And as for Mrs. Carter, people thought a great deal of her letters just because she had written on Epictetus. But Miss Matty was quite sure Deborah would never have used such a common expression as to say she could not be bothered. It was evident that Miss Matty did grudge burning these letters from her sister. She would not let them be carelessly passed over with any quiet reading to myself. She took them from me and even lighted the second candle in order to read them aloud with a proper emphasis and without stumbling over the big words. Oh, how I wanted facts instead of reflections before those letters were concluded. They lasted us 2 nights. I will not deny that I made use of the time to think of many other things, and yet I always remained at my post at the end of each sentence. The rector's letters, and those of his wife and mother-in-law, had all been tolerably short and pithy, written in a straight hand with the lines very close together. Sometimes the whole letter was contained on a mere scrap of paper. The paper was very yellow and the ink very brown. Some of the sheets, as Miss Matty made me observe, were the old original post, with a stamp in the corner representing a postboy riding for his life, twanging his horn. The letters from Mrs. Jenkins and her mother were fastened with a great round red wafer, for this was before Miss Edgeworth's novel, Patronage, had banished wafers from polite society. It was also evident from their tenor that francs, a parliamentary privilege of free postage, were in great request and were even used as a means of paying debts. The rector sealed his epistles with an immense coat of arms, showing by his care that he expected them to be cut open, not broken by any thoughtless hand. Now, Miss Jenkins' letters were of a later date in form and writing. She wrote on the square sheet which we have learned to call old-fashioned. Her hand was admirably calculated, together with her use of many-syllabled words, to fill up a sheet, and then came the pride and delight of crossing the lines to save paper. Poor Miss Matty got sadly puzzled by this, for the words gathered sighs like snowballs, and towards the end of her letters, Miss Jenkins would become quite sesquipedalian. In one to her father, slightly theological in tone, she had spoken of Herod, Tetrarch of Idumea. Miss Matty, in her reading, turned this into Herod Petrarch of Etruria, and was just as well pleased as if she had been right. I cannot quite remember the date, but I think it was in 1805 that Miss Jenkins wrote the longest series of letters during a visit to some friends near Newcastle upon Tyne. These friends were intimate with the commandant of the garrison there, and heard from him of all the preparations being made to repel the invasion of Bonaparte. Some people imagined this might take place at the mouth of the Tyne. Miss Jenkins was evidently very much alarmed. The first part of her letters was often written in pretty intelligible English, conveying particulars of the preparations. She described the bundles of clothes packed and ready for a flight to Alston Moor, and the signal that was to be given for this flight. This signal, as I recall, was to consist of the church bells being rung in a particular and ominous manner. One day, while Miss Jenkins and her hosts were at a dinner party, this warning summons was actually given. It was not a very wise proceeding, if there is any truth in the fable of the boy and the wolf, but so it was. Miss Jenkins, hardly recovered from her fright, wrote the next day to describe the sound, the breathless shock, the hurry and alarm. Then, taking a breath, she had added a philosophical note to her father, reflecting on how trivial all their apprehensions of the last evening appeared at that moment to calm and inquiring minds. It was here that Miss Matty broke in. She insisted that, indeed, the fears were not at all trivial or trifling at the time. She knew, for she used to wake up in the night many a time, thinking she heard the tramp of the French entering Cranford. She recalled how many people talked of hiding themselves in the salt mines. Meat would have kept capitally down there, she added, only perhaps they would have been thirsty. Her father had preached a whole set of sermons on the occasion. One set in the mornings was all about David and Goliath, to spirit up the people to fight with spades or bricks if need were. The other set in the afternoons was to prove that Napoleon, another name for Boney as they used to call him, was the same as the demons Apollyon and Abaddon. She remembered her father rather thought he should be asked to print this last set, but the parish had, perhaps, had enough of them with the hearing. Peter Marmaduke Arley Jenkins, or Poor Peter, as Miss Matty now called him, was at school at Shrewsbury by this time. The rector took up his pen and his Latin once more to correspond with his boy. It was clear the lad's letters were what are called show letters. They were of a highly mental description, giving an account of his studies and his intellectual hopes, with an occasional quotation from the classics. But now and then, the animal nature broke out in a little sentence, evidently written in a trembling hurry after the letter had been inspected. In it, he would plead with his dear mother to send him a cake with plenty of citron. The mother dear probably answered her boy in the form of cakes and other goodies, for none of her letters were among this set. But there was a whole collection from the rector, to whom the Latin in his boy's letters was like a trumpet to an old war horse. I do not know much about Latin, but to judge from the bits I remember from the rector's letters, it seemed more ornamental than useful. One letter noted that a certain town was not on Peter's map of Ireland, but added that, as the proverb says, even a good Bernard does not see everything. Presently, it became very evident that poor Peter got himself into many scrapes. There were letters of stilted penitence to his father for some wrongdoing. And among them all was one blotted note, which was badly written, badly sealed, and badly directed. In it, he pleaded with his dearest mother. He promised he would be a better boy, indeed he would, but begged her not to be ill for his sake. He wrote that he was not worth it, but that he would be good for his darling mother. He promised he would be a better boy, indeed he would, but begged her not to be ill for his sake. He wrote that he was not worth it, but that he would be good for his darling mother. Miss Matty could not speak for crying after she had read this note. She gave it to me in silence, and then got up and took it to the sacred recesses of her own room, for fear it might be burnt by any chance. She lamented about poor Peter, saying he was always in scrapes and was too easy. She felt that others had led him wrong and then left him in the lurch. He was just too fond of mischief. She sighed, and could never resist a joke.